happy when you wake up?
No.
How you doing?
Do I know you?
Detective Malloy? Miss Avery, there was a homicide in your neighborhood on the 15th. What's all this?
Quotes that I like, poetry.
I want to do with you what spring does with the cherry trees. My number's there if you remember anything. Give me a call, all right? Do I know you from someplace? Maybe you wouldn't mind taking a look at a few pictures.
Take a deep breath. This one's kind of graphic.
It was dark, and there was a man and a girl, and I watched.
You like that sort of thing? You like watching?
Somebody asked me out.
Who?
Police detective. He's investigating a girl's murder. You know, the one who got cut up.
I could be whatever you want me to be. Ain't much I haven't done.
Are you dating him?
I don't think it's a good idea that we see each other anymore.
Well, another girl's been murdered. This guy likes blood. Take those off.
I'm not gonna sleep tonight.
Put your hand between your legs.
Do you ever tell the truth?
Something wrong?
Did you kill her?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to the first live in-discussion event for Female Desire on Screen. I'm Christina Newland. I'm the curator of the season, which is currently streaming on BFI Player. And the season is designed to highlight the inspiration for all of it, which is She Found It at the Movies, the book I've edited, which features Simran Hans, who is the film critic at The Observer and has contributed an essay to the book about In the Cut, Jane Campion's film. So, hi, Simran.
Hello.
Can you tell those of us who maybe haven't seen the film, though I don't know why yet, why you decided to write about it for the book?
I decided to write about this film because it had been kind of percolating in my mind for several years, really since I watched it as a teenager. But maybe the kind of like best way for me to tee it up is to just read an excerpt from my essay from the book, which kind of gives you a little bit of a sense of how I first heard of it.
Okay, you do that, and I'm going to make sure that the dog doesn't bang the door down.
So, in fact, I first heard of In the Cut via Judd Apatow's 2007 sex comedy Knocked Up. In that film, Ben, who's played by Seth Rogen, is a schlubby layabout, and he kind of finds himself inadvertently entangled with Katherine Heigl's attractive careerist broadcaster, Alison, following a one-night stand that leaves her pregnant. What begins as an eyebrow-raising male fantasy soon morphs into a nightmare scenario for all genders and a moralistic finger jab in the direction of those who choose to indulge in casual sex. Ben doesn't have a job exactly, but he's starting an internet website with his roommate. Its premise is to timestamp and catalogue the nude scenes of famous actresses. So Ben says, "Say you love Meg Ryan." And Alison, Katherine Heigl's character, says, "I do." And Ben says, "Great, who doesn't? Say you like her so much you want to know every movie where she shows her tits. Come to our webpage exclusively, type in Meg Ryan, bam, In the Cut, 38 minutes in, 48 minutes in, like an hour and 10 minutes in. She's like naked that whole fucking movie. She does full frontal in that movie." I think you have to take your hat off to her in The Cut, and not just because she takes her knickers off, but because she moves all traces of her celebrity, said Andrew Anthony in a 2003 profile of Ryan for The Observer. There's a sleazy, facetious edge to his comment, but Anthony wasn't wrong that the role of Franny represented a rejection of Ryan's star persona. Ryan wasn't thought of as a character actor, but instead a bona fide movie star whose brand was wholesomeness personified. She was and still is best known for starring in Nora Ephron's romantic comedies When Harry Met Sally, Sleepless in Seattle, and You've Got Mail. I knew her for this holy trifecta too. Audiences liked that she was blonde, bubbly, cutely neurotic, and completely clothed. She was sexy, sure, but like most romantic comedy heroines, not exactly sexual. Consider the I'll have what she's having scene in When Harry Met Sally that cemented her as a household name. In it, Ryan Sally sits across from Billy Crystal's Harry in a crowded New York City diner, adamant that most women fake their orgasms. When he protests, maintaining that he can tell the difference, she performs one with convincing theatricality. Afterwards, an onlooker tells the waiter she'll have what Sally's having. The scene is played for comedy, distancing the character, and therefore Ryan, from anything resembling an actual erotic experience. Indeed, the film seems more comfortable showing Sally pretending to have a sex life than depicting her enjoying one. In Sleepless in Seattle and You've Got Mail, Ryan's characters are barely afforded so much as a chaste kiss. Women's sexual satisfaction is not built into the rom-com genre. In fact, the very acknowledgement of female carnality disrupts it. According to convention, at the end of the movie, the heroine gets her happily ever after. The acquisition of a relationship is the end goal, the prize to be won. What she does with her winnings is not of anyone's concern. A more desirous woman, on the other hand, might discover that sex, her own happy ending, if you will, can be reward enough.
I love that you acknowledge that in this kind of artificial bubble of the romantic comedy, particularly the mainstream kind that Meg Ryan was most famous for, that sex is kind of the side dish to the romantic pairing, which is the important goal. But I also feel like even in erotic thrillers, which I guess In the Cut could be characterized as, women are usually more sexually active or have more sex, but it's usually not, pleasure isn't the end game most of the time.
Completely, and I think this is one of the most fascinating things about In the Cut, that yes, like you say, it is kind of quite squarely in the erotic thriller genre, but most of those films are insanely sexist. They're so voyeuristic. Women who are horny, basically, often get killed off. The tropes are very similar to that of like a horror movie, or if they don't get their kind of violent comeuppance, then they're totally perceived as crazy or kind of sort of villainous to the men in the film. And what's interesting about In the Cut is that it's super focused on Meg Ryan's character, Franny, who's an English teacher. And I guess I should sort of set up the film a little bit for anyone who might not have seen it. And I'm sorry, there are going to be some spoilers. But Meg Ryan plays an English teacher in New York, and she sort of finds or hears about a woman's severed limb outside her apartment window. And so there's this whole sort of investigation going on around her, and the detective who is investigating the case sort of becomes romantically entangled, and there's this threat of a killer kind of looming, but nobody really knows who it is until the end of the film. And In the Cut spends a lot of time kind of showing us how this quite grotesque and horrible experience, well, not experience, but sort of thing that's happened, is weirdly turning on the character of Franny. She's kind of aroused by the danger of it. And you see this kind of showing up in a bunch of different scenes of the film. I mean, in one of the early scenes, she sees a guy getting a blowjob in a bar, and then later she sort of uses that as fodder for her own fantasy. In the film's kind of crucial sex scene, with Mark Ruffalo's character, it's so kind of centered on her pleasure. And the kind of flip side to that, that's quite interesting, and I think makes this film really like explicitly feminist, is the way it acknowledges the threat of male desire, both in terms of this killer as a looming presence, and that being a sort of metaphor for the danger of male carnality, but also in the interactions with Detective Malloy and how loaded they are, and how kind of, dangerous and thrilling, but also, potentially extremely destructive they are as well.
And yeah, I felt like on rewatching this film, I was reminded how much Jane Campion is touching on something which was kind of key to me with editing this book. And there's a whole section called Fantasy and Danger, which your essay is a part of, which touches on that idea of how to reconcile, demanding the kind of sex you want as a heterosexual woman, but also being aware of the necessary, as you say, kind of danger of male carnality and male desire. And to me, one of the key moments in that film that starts to answer that question or tries to make an attempt to reconcile that is in the first sex scene between the two of them, where she's been mugged on the street earlier that evening. And he, as a cop, is asking her, obviously he's very charged, but he's asking her, go through it again, what happened? And then says, okay, show me. And you describe the scene at length in your essay as well. And, she tells him, oh, he grabbed me like around the neck. He had me in like a chokehold, basically. And he puts his arms around her. And so basically they're almost replaying this extremely dangerous, scary thing that's happened to her. But there's such a difference here because it's being replayed for her own fantasy in the safe space of her own apartment. And the key thing to that is that she turns around at one point and looks at him and says, all right. And that is the moment of verbal consent that she's giving, which changes that fantasy from just being the kind of way that rape culture can change the way that people talk about, oh, well, she was asking for it, she likes it rough, no means yes, into something very different because she gives consent in that way.
And I think it's really delicately done in the film because in movies, in real life, that moment is of consent. It can be so subtle, and I think the choice to make it explicit and to have her kind of give that verbal consent. Later in the scene, he produces a condom. He's like got his gun and he puts it to one side. So it's very clear that he's like not a threat anymore. There are all these moments in the film that kind of signal to us that actually this is safe and that, Franny is not going to be, it's not that kind of jolting moment that's very typical of the genre where you have this tense erotic build-up and then something violent happens. Jane Campion gives us a bunch of different cues to let us know that this is a consensual scene. And it's importantly still very sexy.
Well, yeah, and I mean, also flipping the idea on its head, the old noir thing of women being essentially fundamentally scary and dangerous, that femme fatale thing. He is the person that we're not sure about, whose motives are uncertain, whose aims, we don't know exactly what he's up to when he's not with Franny. And that's played really well. And the actual genuine danger of men and his wife-beating partner weird and follows her around and turns up at her apartment unannounced. And so there's this kind of interesting sliding scale of male entitlement and violence, I think, in the movie. She's kind of surrounded by it on all sides. And I thought that was really interesting in as much as like she becomes confused about who the killer could be, and quite easily so, because there's that level around danger, which is not that outlandish, I suppose.
Yeah, definitely. I think as well, like another way of thinking about the threat in the film. Yes, that is a kind of way of thinking about sex and how sex figures in the film. But something that's really interesting is that it's a 9/11 film, right? So the film was released in 2003. It was supposed to shoot in 2001, and the production got pushed back to spring 2002. And it was actually the first movie to be allowed to shoot in Manhattan after 9/11 had happened. And So Mayer, a brilliant critic, academic, writer, genius,
there too,
who also appears and has an essay in the book. They have a really interesting line where they kind of see New York and Franny as kind of mirrors of each other. And I'm gonna quote from their essay. You can find it if you Google So Mayer in the Verso. They wrote for Verso Books. And they say, it's difficult not to read Franny as a figure of New York. First, spiky, assertive, intellectual, and alienated, then haunted, vulnerable, and defensive after she witnesses the prelude of a murder that causes the state to invade her privacy and then enter her private life. And I thought that was really interesting how that sort of connection is drawn between the unease of Franny and all the things that are kind of looming at the edges and threatening her, and the mood of New York City after this catastrophe had happened. And the movie is very skeptical of the police as well. I mean, Malloy is a cop, but he's not by any means a kind of trustworthy figure. And so there's a lot of tension and unease and spikiness to do with the state as well.
I do wonder, actually, having thought about that, if it had been a different type of film made by a different type of director, that is to say, a male director or a male genre director particularly, and the portrayal of the NYPD was as cynical as what it is, and showing them to be kind of homophobic and kind of a little racist and all the things that you see, would it have gotten more negative mainstream attention with it being so soon after 9/11, I wonder. But maybe because of the kind of film that it was slightly more ignored. Not that it didn't get slated for a million other reasons, but...
well, the film's critical reception was really, I mean, it's really sad, actually, when you look back on it. As I kind of mentioned in my essay, I first heard of it through a sort of off-the-cuff remark in the movie Knocked Up. But I think the most famous thing about this film, besides the fact that Meg Ryan was naked in it, was this quite terrible, still on YouTube, if you want to look it up later, interview that she did with Michael Parkinson on British TV. And this interview is an absolute car crash, and it basically ended her career. I mean, she didn't really go on to make that many films after. She made The Women, quite bad remake of the George Cukor film in 2008. But she's not really kind of flourished as an actress after this point. I know, Christina, you were saying she made Kate and Leopold quite soon after, but I guess she would have been shooting at the same time. And yeah, that interview, he sort of asked her how she felt about getting naked and why she did it and why she sort of was willing to tarnish her reputation as America's sweetheart. He's really belligerent and, he totally wouldn't get away with it now. And she gets really defensive and really awkward and really uncomfortable. And clearly there's just, he's sort of goading her, and it's really cruel. But she received a lot of criticism for kind of, smashing up her star image as this good girl and doing this gritty role that a lot of people felt uncomfortable watching her in. I mean, the role, it should be said, so the film's based on Susanna Moore's novel, and Nicole Kidman, who had obviously worked with Jane Campion before, she had bought the rights to the novel. And so they had started developing it together, and Nicole Kidman was going to play the role of Franny. And for whatever reason, she didn't end up doing it. And so they cast Meg Ryan, and Nicole Kidman still has a producer credit on the film. And you can kind of see it, right? Sort of the way they've done her hair, the sexuality of the performance reminds me a little bit of Eyes Wide Shut.
There's an aloofness too to her, particularly in the beginning, and that screams Nicole Kidman.
Definitely. But nobody had seen Meg Ryan do this kind of serious, gritty, sexual role. And a lot of people didn't respond well to it. Obviously, at the time, more male critics were reviewing films than now, and people were largely unkind about it. But it's interesting to see that the film has had a kind of feminist revival, or has kind of gained a sort of popular cult appeal in the last, 5-7 years, something like that.
I think the one quote that you use in your essay from a male reviewer, where he calls the film, he says the film has anguished gynocentrism, as though the whole film is almost obsessed with womb-like imagery and obsessed with the female-centric experience, and it's such a strange thing to say, but as though the majority of films aren't full of phallic symbols, or I just cannot grasp how you could so confidently say that about a film.
It's because there's a lot of sepia tone, Christina. I mean, yeah, I think that reviewer gets really kind of caught up in the murkiness of the film's visual palette, and the kind of the browns and the reds and the greens, and how often she's underground and in tunnels and on the subway. And I understand that sort of reading of the film, but it's so kind of missing the point, I think, and yeah, I think it doesn't give the character of Franny enough credit, and doesn't kind of appreciate her agency and how radical that is.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think, and to what you said about the idea of Meg Ryan's star persona being kind of the idea of lost innocence is something that, with its movie stars, America's always grappled with. I think if you start out as a star that begins with sexy roles, then there's, I guess, less room for you to fall in the public's, vision. But with somebody like Meg Ryan, nobody wanted to see her tarnished. And there was such a lot of weird paternalism kind of built into that perspective.
Completely, but also I guess the thing to consider is there was a different time. So coming out of the end of the 90s, the early noughties, I don't think movie stars, and I guess you could argue that like movie stars aren't really kind of built and groomed in the same mold either. But I think now you have somebody who's sort of like, they're given an indie as their sort of breakout film, and then they might get put in a studio film, whereas this is the other way around. Like Meg Ryan's breakout was as a kind of Hollywood A-lister, and
slightly more old school way of kind of protecting one's image as well, or the studios protecting one's image, minus social media.
Exactly. And I guess I talk about this a little bit in the essay, but if you try and think of contemporaneous examples of female Hollywood movie stars, you have people like Kristen Stewart or Jennifer Lawrence, or Emma Stone, I guess. I think she was like one of the other examples I chose, like people of that kind of profile. And the more challenging, more kind of sexual roles are just built into their careers because it's less of a shock, seen as less of a provocation, maybe.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess you could. Kristen Stewart is maybe the closest example at first because she became famous through Twilight and being a teen star, and that was a children's film, but I think she sort of dispensed of that image pretty quickly in her career, and now she's doing almost no mainstream stuff.
This is true. The pair of them actually from Twilight. I'm going off on a tangent, but just made such interesting choices off the back of that. But then I also wonder if although you say Twilight's a children's film, I think it was curiously sexually charged.
It's basically 50 Shades of Grey fan fiction, right?
This is it, right? This is it, yeah. So, and I think a lot of adult women were into it as well. So maybe that helped soften the perception of that.
I mean, to be demeaning to Twilight by calling it a children's film. I guess what I mean is more that it was marketed at a teenage audience and at young women in particular.
I was interested in the part of your essay where you talked about the camera's gaze, particularly during sex scenes, where it's sort of free floating, but it doesn't privilege the male gaze, but it also doesn't specifically take the point of view of Franny. And I was wondering if you could kind of talk a little bit more about what was special about that to you.
Yeah. Well, I guess when you think about sex scenes and about porn, really, I guess it's shot in a way where you want to see the whole body, and it's kind of designed for the viewer's titillation. And this is quite interesting because it begins with sort of Franny taking off her clothes, but it doesn't really linger on her body. You see that she's naked, obviously, but it doesn't linger on the body parts. And there's a lot more of a kind of like embodied sensuality to the way that scene is blocked. The way it doesn't focus on him at all. Only it focuses on the acts that he's doing. But in a way that totally serves her. And at the end, it's really racy. But at the end, when she has an orgasm, it's sort of, you see her climax, but then the film or the shot kind of fades, and then it suggests a repetition, but it doesn't kind of.
It's not explicit in that sense.
No, and it doesn't give you any kind of like. Sorry, I'm getting so awkward here. What it doesn't do is it doesn't give you the sense of like male completion, sex being over. You know, you see like her orgasm, you don't really see what's going on with him or whether he gets off. The camera is not interested in that. And it doesn't sort of hang around to find out. It's implied that, you know, it's a mutually enjoyable experience. But I think it's really interesting that she chooses to cut the scene there, because I think the way we think about heterosexual sex, at least, is that it is so focused on the guy. It's so focused on the guy coming. And that's really reinforced in a lot of sex scenes in films, even ones that aren't that explicit. Mm-hmm. And so I thought that it was really interesting that this film just doesn't do that at all.
I also think it's interesting that beyond showing masturbation, beyond showing him going down on her, it also makes a point of talking about it in a way which is even still, you know, I was saying before we started this, I rewatched the film this morning, and I was sitting, which is just a funny film to watch in the morning anyway, because it's, you know, pretty full on. And like after they have sex, he's talking in bed about learning the proper technique with which to go down on a woman. No, I'm getting awkward. And I mean, even just the fact that he's talking about which way he needs to move his tongue on the clit is, you're like, this is not something I hear that isn't, this is not a comedy film. Like usually like that stuff is relegated to like gross out comedies, right? Because immediately women's body parts, it must be gross or it has to be fun.
Completely. And I think that's like something that kind of goes back to the rom-com genre. Like nowadays, maybe in romantic comedies, women are permitted to be more sexual, but the sex scenes are almost always comedic or humiliating, and any kind of anatomical detail is, like you said, automatically put into the category of gross out, and that is not the case here.
Do you think that you were saying something about the film starting to get a little bit of a reevaluation? And I've seen that, you talking about it. I've seen a few other female critics talking about it quite a lot on Twitter and stuff. Do you see it being a film that may continue to get looked at differently as time goes on and maybe screened elsewhere? You know,
I mean,
more
I hope so. I'm pretty sure it was BAM Cinematheque in New York that did it as a double bill with Klute, which works quite nicely.
Yeah, that's really cool.
But yeah, I think Jane Campion is a really interesting filmmaker, and her filmography is quite varied. And this one was not one of her more popular movies, which is odd given that it had such big movie stars in it, and it was contemporary, and it was set in New York, and it wasn't a kind of period piece. And so, yeah, I hope that it continues to kind of be percolating in people's minds, and yeah,
have a second life of some kind.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah. Well, the plan was to screen it at BFI South Bank, of course. But naturally, that's no longer happening. So at the very least, it's available to rent on BFI Player, along with the rest of the Female Desire on Screen season. So there's a few things for people to check out on there. Hopefully be interested in either revisiting like Dirty Dancing, or maybe coming to for the first time like In the Cut or Watermelon Woman. I encourage people to have a look and check it out. And we'll be doing another event like this on Wednesday, the 6th of May, I think around the same time, about the film Bound, directed by the Wachowski sisters.
Great film.
So yeah, so this has been really nice. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you for having me.
And I'm just going to double check. I'm going to have a little sneaky look at the hashtag. See if anybody has any questions. I saw a few people shared some things when you tweeted about this earlier, talking about some of the magazine covers at the time with Meg Ryan. It was like about seeing her naked. Like the entire marketing around the film was just, look at Meg Ryan's tits, guys. And like if that was the audience that was coming to see this film, it's no wonder people came away. But
it's a disturbing cover image of her in this weird push-up bra. She doesn't look very Meg Ryan in it.
Oh dear. All right. Well, thank you, like I said, again, for joining me. And thank you for anyone who tuned in.
Thanks. Bye.
Take care. Bye.